disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. This is the gospel according to John. So now you've heard the Decalogue twice, if you got to hear what I said at the beginning, and you've heard the gospel twice, and I'm not going to read you the other one twice. But you've also had the opportunity through the psalm and through some of our hymns this morning to hear the word of God repeatedly. And the reason we repeat the word of God, and sometimes we repeat psalms and we repeat the same stories and we give each other the same advice, the same 10 commandments that were heard by the people of Israel in Exodus. The reason we repeat all this tradition is because we need to hear in our praise to God the stability of God and the way that God creates our reality around us in connection with our own reality that we're living. The opening hymn, Praise to the Living God, contains a lot of this theme. It reminds us that we are praising a God who is living, but as one of my friends reminded me, is not exactly alive. Is not alive in the way that we are, in the way that we grow and we change and we die. The living God is living because God is living, the source of all living things, the ground of all being, the thing that does all the creation. Praise to the living God, all praised be his name, who was and is to be, for aye the same, always the same. The one eternal God, ere aught that now appears, before all things that now appear, the first, the last, beyond all thought, his timeless years. Formless, all lovely forms declare his loveliness. Holy, no holiness of earth can his express. He is Lord of all. Creation speaks his praise, and everywhere above, below, his will obeys. And that is carried forward in the tradition that we hear in Moses giving the teachings of God to people on a mountain, in the place, the natural place where they would go to be close to the utmost being. In their cosmology, God is above, and they are in the middle, and there's something below that's chaotic that they don't want to be in. Our cosmology is different. We understand that we're on a round thing, and we're in space, and that all those things revolve around each other, and that God yet is in that, and that God yet was there before all of it came forth in the Big Bang from the chaos. We understand all that differently now, and yet God, we still need to remember, is there before all things, formless, and yet in all lovely forms, changeless, timeless, and yet able to journey with us in our changes and our times. God is the living God, but God is really the one holy and living God. Those three attributes are important because we desire all of them. Because we are made in the image of God and made to reflect God's goodness, we always want to be one. We want to be united. We want to be together. We want to be holy. We want to be well and healthy and strong. We want to be as we should be. We build symmetrical and interestingly different buildings to house our worship of God. We build careful things to understand the sacred because we want to be holy and we want to make things that feel right, whether they're neo-Gothic buildings or they're white clapboard churches that reflect the oneness of God and the lack of ornamentation that can express God, or whether they're great cathedrals or whether they're just the best arrangement of chairs in little storefronts. We want to make a holy place. We want to understand God in structures, and we want to be together. We also want to be living. We want to be responding to God. We want to be able to see all the ways that life is flowing and energetic in God's creation. We don't want to just be static. We want all these things, and we want to be close to them. So even those of us who aren't religious seek these things out and wind up in all kinds of places, creating all kinds of structures for themselves to express the oneness, the holiness, and the livingness of God. The people of Israel did exactly that thing the first time they received the commandments. If you remember, they didn't receive them. They didn't receive them because they were too busy worshiping a golden calf that they had made out of their anxiety and their desire to see God and to make something beautiful that they could worship. They couldn't wait to experience the oneness, the holiness, the livingness, the beauty of God that would be expressed to them when Moses came down the mountain. So they made that calf, and they experienced God's response to that, which was really bad. They ate a lot of gold because Moses had that calf ground up and made them eat it. I don't think that was a pleasant experience. But that story of their desire to make something for themselves and preempt what God is doing is an important story to remember. It comes from a good impulse. It comes from the desire to make the world make sense. And then, of course, Moses comes and gives them a way to make the world make sense. The tablets of stone, the very, very firm Decalogue that we read at the beginning of our service in Lent to remind ourselves of whose we are and what we are, and that we have limitations. Those things, when we teach them to little kids in godly play, are called the 10 best ways. They're not called the 10 commandments because little kids don't really get it when you tell them, God just says so. And also, little kids don't totally get about adultery or murder or any of those things because they haven't entered into a world where those things happen and they need to be given boundaries around them. But we teach our children those stories, and we teach them the 10 best ways or some other way of teaching them the 10 commandments because we know at some point in their lives they will encounter the desires and the things that they fear and the anxieties and the processes they don't understand, and they will try to make idols for themselves, whether it's some other god, like astrology, or an Instagram influencer, or some other way of experiencing holiness. They will see that, and they will need somebody to remind them there are no other gods. There is just the one God. However you express your worship, there is just the one God who is worthy of it. And then they will need, when they grow up, to remember about adultery. They will. Whether they commit it or not, whether they have to live in a messy relationship and they have to get out of it and then they have to find another way to express their love, that they will need to be reminded that adultery is a harmful thing, even if it's done out of a desire to be free. Even if it's done because we have good reasons. It is still a harmful thing. They will need to be reminded that killing is wrong. Even though our society tells us that killing for the purposes of vengeance, if done by the state, is okay. They will need all these things, even if we think that they are far from our children. even if we think we can teach them how to live without these things, and we can to an extent, if we do not teach them about the one holy and living God who gives us these ways, then all they are is rules. And all they are is things that hold us in. And if we break them, then we have no way back. As the people of Israel actually did have. Yes, they worshiped that golden calf. And then they repented and returned to the Lord. And then later they did it again. They made more idols. And the prophets told them to stop. And they repented and returned to the Lord. And then they made more idols. And then they made a sacrificial system that by the time they got to Jesus' time made no sense whatsoever. And all it was supporting a temple that had been built as a marker of their return from exile and then renovated by Herod the Great. Herod the Great's not the same Herod that we remember from Jesus' story. Herod the Great is a really bad ruler. The story about Herod the Great is that he was a servant of the Hasmonean dynasty. So he was the servant of Israelite kings who were ruling at the pleasure of Rome. And they weren't very well liked. Anyway, the story is that he killed all of them, except one princess that he wanted to marry. The story that the rabbis tell is that she threw herself off a building so that he would not be able to claim that he was a legitimate ruler by marrying her. So this is Herod the Great. Whatever the story is really, that's the story that is told about Herod the Great. And the big thing about him is that he built major public works. He built the port at Caesar Maritima. He built a lot of palaces and temples. This person's name was probably on all kinds of things all over Judea. And the one thing that he did that is important to our gospel today is that he renovated the second temple. So the temple that the scribes and the Pharisees are telling Jesus has been under construction for 46 years, that temple, that's the one that Herod has been renovating for 46 years. He's been making a monument to his own power out of God's holy place for 46 years. He's not alive anymore. His son is now the king of the Jews, which is not a title really, but it's the one he took. He's not alive anymore, but his legacy is still in this story. In fact, the temple isn't there anymore by the time the people in John's community are telling this story to each other. The temple's been destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, and we kind of think that this story, the way that John tells it in the Gospels, is later than that. So why? Why is this story about the temple the first story we really get about Jesus doing ministry in John? It's really different. It's really different than in the Synoptic Gospels. In the Synoptic Gospels, this story appears right before Jesus gets crucified. It's the climax of his conflict with the religious authorities. In this story that John tells, it's the beginning of his conflict with the religious authorities. It's the first time that he comes into major conflict with the people who are running the temple. He drives out the sheep and the goats, he turns over the money changers' tables, and he says, "Do not make this place my Father's house, a place for markets, a marketplace. Don't do that. The way that you've constructed reality around God's holiness, around the sacrificial system, is the wrong way. Stop doing it." John starts with this because for John's community, that's the most important thing. They're trying to create a new community around the holiness and the righteousness of God, the oneness, the livingness of God, amidst people who are questioning it all the time. They're always doing that. They're always saying, you're not really worshiping one God because you're worshiping Jesus. So they need to fight back against that in their stories. They need to build an identity for themselves on the holiness and righteousness of God expressed in Jesus Christ. That's the identity that we get from them as Christians. And yet they weren't building a church in the way that we see the church. They could not possibly have known how this would turn out. They and the other early Christian communities were not preparing to build houses of worship like this one, or like St. Martin's, or like St. David's, or like the Catholic Church, or like the Presbyterian Church, or like the church with a big C at all. They weren't doing that. They were building for themselves an identity around the one holy and living God that they worshiped. And the things that worked for them in the early church would not work for us. There's no way back, as much as we would like, to the early church. And the things that worked for people who were coming to faith in the middle of the 6th century or the 7th century in Europe would not make sense for us either. And the things that worked for the people who came to faith in the United States in the 19th century, when the Great Awakening unleashed a lot of evangelists, not very many Episcopal evangelists, but a lot of evangelists all over the country, and put little white churches in all kinds of places in the United States, those structures wouldn't work for them either in the Johannine community. All they were trying to do was survive and pass on what they knew of the one holy and living God to their children. I've been thinking about processes that this resembles, and it's hard to find a process that the church's development resembles more than the way that families grow. Because we are, at our heart, in the DNA of the church, the family of God. And so when we build communities, like the Johannine community, or like the community that Jesus was building around himself, that required him to go into the temple and make a big fuss, required him to challenge what was built already. What he was replacing it with was a different structure. A structure of friends, a structure of people who were connected to each other through their relationship to him, more than through their relationship to the temple. He was creating a new structure for them. The family structures that we have all known, of course, are really different now than they were even 50 years ago. The family structures that we live in now are very different than they were in the 12th century when a lot of our marriage traditions came about. They're really different than they were in Moses' time, when plural marriage was a thing. They're really different than all those things, and yet they are still holding the holiness, the oneness, and the livingness of God. They are the way that creation is recreated in each generation of humans. So I was thinking about families, and I was thinking, because I live in a different kind of family, of the experience that Molly and I have been having in trying to bring children into our family. And the reason I think this is kind of like this story of bringing a new kind of temple about is that we have no idea what's going to come out the other side of this process. Even more than happens when you get pregnant and you wait 9 months for the baby to come, and you don't really know what the baby's going to be like until you see the baby, and you don't know what their personality is like until you meet the baby. Well, even more than that, adoption is this very odd mixture of preparation, patience, and no freaking idea what's going on, because it's so dependent on other people and other things. So what you're getting out of it is a child of some age that you are willing to accept. And so if you're willing to accept a child of virtually any age and virtually any background, which we are, there are some limits to what we feel we can do as parents, but we really do feel like we would be fine with a 7-year-old child or a 13-year-old child or a 16-year-old teenager. Whoever God needs to be our child is who we're ready for. So it's been a very odd process. And all I can liken it to is that God is building some new structure of family over here that I can't quite see yet. And it's frustrating, and it's anxiety producing. And it's something that I don't fully understand. But when I do get to the place where God has created that family, and this sounds very weird and idealistic, I know, but when the child is there that is supposed to be our child, and they know it and we know it, and we adopt them, then we will know what the structure of our family will be. But in the meantime, I can't even decide whether I should buy a twin-size bed or a full-size bed, because I don't know the size of the child. And I can't even decide if I want to, I can't figure anything out until I figure that out. So it's very hard, and it's an anxiety-producing thing, and I could force it. I could push on it. I could try to go out and go online and find the child. And I could start telling the workers, this is the child I think is the child for us, right? Or I could spend all my time calling them and bothering them. Or I could wait and I could pray and I could see where the things are coming together. And then I could join in building that structure. And there will come a time when that family structure will not exactly coalesce and not be solid, because that's not how living relationships work. But it'll be clearer. And it'll be clearer to me what kind of parent I'm preparing to be. Am I preparing to help a teenager deal with being adopted, or am I preparing to help a 7-year-old deal with being adopted? Those are two really different parenting styles and strategies. And that's something that Molly and I have been living with for years now, so we've gotten used to it, and it's okay. And that's part of it too. The longer you live in that kind of uncertainty of seeing something that God is doing that's new, but not being totally sure what it is, and faithfully going one step at a time forward with God while God creates that thing, the experience of doing that is a profound spiritual experience. Because it requires that we delay our gratification. And it requires that we turn away a little bit from what we want to have happen. And it requires that we trust that the one living and holy God, who is changeless, who has created everything that is, knows where we're going when we don't. I think for these two churches that we have that are growing together in a covenant relationship, this kind of experience is the kind of experience we're going to have. We are rebuilding a structure for worshiping God together. We are rebuilding a structure of being the family of God together. We are rethinking how we invite other people into that family. And we are going to experience all of the anxiety and fear and desire to turn back and just stop this process that one experiences in other kinds of transitions like that. We have no idea where we're going, and yet we do, because we know we are going there with God, who is creating a new thing, who is building a structure around us. And the old structures still serve us in ways that we might be surprised by. The 10 Commandments still serve the church now in different ways than they served the Israelites thousands of years ago, or the medieval church, or the 18th century church, where people used to put it on the wall so you could read it every Sunday in church because you needed to hear the 10 Commandments every single Sunday in church, or you would stop being Christian. And you needed to hear the creeds every Sunday in church, or you would stop being Christian. And if your children didn't know them, there was something wrong with you. Because your salvation would not be assured without knowing these things. It served them differently. then it serves us. And we have to be willing to join in that process, even when it's really scary. So when we get back together in a few months, we will not be in the same churches that we were in before. We can't be because of the pandemic. We also can't be because of what we are doing as churches, where we are acknowledging that what we are doing is following the one holy and living God into a new future for us. And so we will not be able to do things the same way we did them before. There will be different service times. You will find yourself in a different church building than you were in before. You will find yourself sitting with someone you never knew before. You will find yourself listening to people read in church that you didn't listen to before. And then you will start to live with it, and you will start to see where God is building something new. And then you will start to see how you can join it. And then we will be at the beginning of another transition, at the beginning of another transformation. And I can't tell you how long it will take, but I can tell you that God is with us in it, all the way. The same thing is happening in churches all over the country. The same thing is happening in churches all over the world. The same thing is happening in families all over the world, because that is the nature of God's creation. God creates, and there is structure, and we don't understand it. And we build ourselves an idol or two, and God destroys those idols. And then we are reminded that God is still there, formless, and that all the lovely forms we are building come from God. So we're going to have conversations when we can have them in person. I know some of you are probably anxious about that and wondering, when are we going to start some of this stuff? What is she doing with her time? And I encourage you to think about and to join fully in those conversations as they happen, because they're going to start happening as we start being able to be in person again. They're going to start happening with our annual meetings that are going to be happening in April, where we're going to review what we've done over the last year and who we've been. And I encourage you to be there for that. And then they're going to start again in May, when we start to be able to get together again a little bit more. And then we might take a little break for the summer, because a lot of people are going to want to go places. And then they're going to start again in September. And then they're going to start again the next phase. So I encourage you to hold on to the one holy and living God, and to remember that all of these things are still useful. These past things, these old hymns, these commandments. Yes, even the sacrificial system with the doves and the ox and the sheep was still useful to Jesus in teaching about the new thing that was coming. He used that system to replace it with a new one. And we are going to do the same types of things. So I invite you into that, and I invite you to pray for it, continue praying for it, and continue to be, as much as you can be, in a non-anxious place about it. Because the story is continuing in both St. Martin's and at Christ Church. And we don't know what the ending is. But we know we're going there with the one holy and living God. Amen.